Chronologically, the first story in which Jesus appears as a figure of any personality is Luke 2:40 through 52, approximately. This is the story of the boy Jesus speaking with the scribes in the temple. Everything before this point is merely things happening to Jesus as an infant, not Jesus actually doing something. The story begins with the following line. And I'm going to display the Greek on the screen. I believe that's what I'm going to do. Even though most of you will simply be listening to this, it's okay because, and this is something that I failed to mention in the introduction. But I'm going to mention it here because my recording of the introduction was great, and if I try to re-record it, I might ruin all of that. And so I forgot to mention it there, but I might as well mention it here right about as I'm about to actually talk about the Greek. When I say that I'm not a scholar, part of that means that I'm not officially trained in Greek. The way that I'm learning the Greek is through Strong's Concordance, Englishman's Concordance, and several others, which break down what the Greek words mean and where they come from, what their typical usage in the Bible is, and all that kind of information. But I don't actually read or speak Greek fluently, although at this point I'm starting to become more and more good at it just from reading so much about it. Anyway, the point being that I also have no idea how to pronounce Greek, which is okay because in preparation for this video, I was trying to look up any kind of resource that would tell me how to pronounce ancient Greek, and it turns out that no one else seems to really have a consensus on that either. So I'm just going to pronounce it intuitively, how it looks to me, and I apologize if it is grating on your ears. If you actually do know ancient Greek and you're like, well, if you do know ancient Greek, then maybe you shouldn't be listening to this because it's possible that do listen to it and then tell me off if I don't know what I'm talking about in the comments. Please, by all means, because that way I might be able to learn something. But I'm going to do my best here. So anyway, I've displayed it on or done my best to display it on the screen because not a lot of things are willing to format ancient Greek for you, but the most literal translation, without any regard for English grammar, so I'm literally just taking the words in the order in which they appear and giving them a rudimentary translation, would be, "So child grew and strengthened, filled wisdom, and grace God's was upon him." Now, if we account for grammar and intent and rearrange things a bit, we get, "So the child grew and strengthened, filled with wisdom, and God's grace was upon him." All right, let's take a closer look at the key words used here and deconstruct that first translation, and then we can put it back together and understand it better. "To" simply means the. It's referring to the noun of the sentence, which is paidion, which just means a young child, older than a toddler, but not old enough for their sex or their gender to matter that much. Then de is a narrative continuation word, kind of like and then or moreover. Euxanen, usually translated as grew, is a past form of oxeno, meaning to grow up, to increase, to wax in magnitude, to enlarge. So we can now translate this so far as, "So the young child matured." Kai, that's the next word, is a positive conjunction, usually meaning and. It can also sometimes mean but. Anything that would positively link two things together, generally speaking, link two phrases together. Ekrataiouto is a form of kratou, coming from krateos, coming from kratos. Now, kratos, the most basic word here, means vigor, and by implication it means power, dominion, strength. For vigor enables one to rule or to control more things, therefore it also means power. This noun, kratos, is then turned into an adjective, which is krateios, which means full of vigor, that is mighty and powerful. You have much power or vigor or energy in you. This is turned into the verb kratau. I sound like an idiot, but that's okay. Meaning to become full of vigor, to become mighty and powerful, to empower or be empowered, to become strong. And this is the word that is used. So we can translate this so far as, so the young child matured and became full of vigor. And we can say become full of vigor so long as we keep in mind the full meaning of that, which the implication being he became strong, he became powerful, but I think this can be meant in a lot of different ways. Pleroumenon is a form of plerou, a form of pleres, a form of pletho. Now, pletho means to furnish or supply, and thus to accomplish something by filling it or completing it with the requisite materials. This verb becomes the adjective pleres, meaning replete, full, complete, meaning what happens once that previous verb has been accomplished, what you get. And this forms into the verb plerou, which is to make replete, to make complete. What was Jesus made replete with? He was made replete with sophia, that is, with wisdom. Now, many of you likely know that this combines with philo to form philosophia, love of wisdom. The word is related to saphes, which means clear or even just clarity. The point is that the Greek concept of wisdom should be conceived as a kind of clear-headedness or clear understanding of things. What kind of things one is wise about is not specified by the word, lending more credence to the notion that it is a general clear-headedness about whatever topics are your concern. But I'm still going to use the term wisdom because I don't want to get too mixed up with implied relations, and it doesn't just mean clear-headedness. So the young child matured and became full of vigor, replete with wisdom. Kai, and, what's more, charis was upon him. Charis comes from the verb kairo, meaning to be full of cheer, calmly happy, well-faring. It serves as a salutary command, not unlike Godspeed or farewell, fare thee well. Thus, the noun charis means graciousness, favor, gift, or pleasure. The idea is that one is granted cheerfulness through the graciousness or grace of another, as in what happens when you say, fare thee well, I'm granting my grace upon you for your continued journey. So my preferred translation that I'm going to use here, just to be, out there and radical, is well-faring, with a little hyphen there, because this seems to, at least for me, retain the original complexity of it being a state granted to you. Generally, it's translated as grace. And just as a side note, the word grace always throws me for a little loop, because I'm like, grace for us, I don't think of grace as like graciousness or like favor or like what it really kind of means in a scriptorial sense, which is something very, very profound and important. I think of like a graceful dancer. So I was always very confused as a kid when everybody kept on talking about grace, and frankly, I don't think that they knew what they were talking about. So I'm not going to be translating it as grace because it just confuses me, and I just can't connect in my head grace with what it really means. I think well-faring or something like that is a better word, flourishing or something like that. So who, in Jesus' case, moving on, granted him this well-faring? Theou, or the supreme deity, God. But what was the well-faring of God doing to Jesus? It ηεύξανεν, that is, it existed upon him, Jesus. So the young child matured and became full of vigor, replete with wisdom, and the well-faring of God was upon him. Now, I've spent so much time on this line for two reasons. First, in order to demonstrate clearly what my method is, my typical method. It's rather laborious, and I will not be showing you the whole thing every time, because that would take forever. But I wanted you to get an idea of what I'm generally doing, and just so that you know. Secondly, this is a verse that tells us quite directly concerning Jesus' character and the development of his character. So we can suspect several things from it. Note that word, suspect. I'm trying to be very tentative about everything here. First, it says Jesus was full of vigor, or he was powerful, owing to a wellspring within him. He was not a sickly boy, but he was a healthy and a hardy one. Keep in mind that later Jesus would be able to endure crucifixion and all its preparatory torture. He had a lot of energy and health in him, which would serve him well with what he was later to set out to do. Second, he was replete with wisdom. Remember the word sophia and how it's related to clarity. The notion is that he developed a healthy mind along with his body. But this is something more remarkable than just bodily health, insofar as a mind furnished perfectly or sufficiently with clearly apprehended wisdom is, alas, not a typical thing. So Jesus did not come off as just smart, but as wise, something which is even more. He had an active brilliance that was enough to strike one as complete, even from a young age. At some point, he became such that there was really nothing to teach him. At least that's how he appeared to people. He was just too smart. His wisdom was already finished. He broke that rule that has always bothered me, that people are always bringing up the notion that your mind is not complete until you're 18, because that's supposedly been scientifically shown. I don't know what they mean by that, and I think it's just an excuse to make them feel better about dumb things that they did when they were a kid, or that they don't understand why other people don't do those things. As for myself, I don't think I've ever related to a single piece of material that talks about what it's supposedly like to be a teenager, and it would seem that, now that sounds really awful, doesn't it? I was about to say, and neither did Jesus, and I'm like, well, crap, I just compared myself to Jesus. Maybe I should stop doing this. Jeez. Well, I'll let it slide. You people can laugh at me. No, darn it. Well, anyway, but yeah, I mean, because what we're going to see, by the way, is that the story puts him at the age of 12 when this all happens, and he's already replete with wisdom. He was not a typical kid, not in that, like, everybody noticed immediately, but it's like if you sat down and talked with him when he's like 12, or if you watched him, you would kind of be like, that's a really good, let me get into the next one because it helps to explain it more. So third, that last phrase, the welfaring of God was upon him. So far, if you want to organize it a little more poetically, we've been told he had a healthy body, he had a healthy mind, and now we're told that he had a healthy spirit. That is, as far as everyone could tell, he was on very good terms with his God. He had a cheerfulness to him, the kind you get when you've just finished a very pleasant lunch with an old and precious friend of yours, and you both part ways feeling uplifted. You've both said farewell to each other, and you have plans to meet up again next week for more of the same. And the one that Jesus was, quote, having lunch dates with was God. He was doing well, everything's dandy. This necessarily means that he had a clear conscience. He slept well at night, and people could tell, because that gives you what people might mistake almost for a kind of carelessness. It's not. That's the only word I can come up with to describe it, because the person is not nearly as worried about things as you might think that they should be. Not because they are careless, but because their spirit is working better, so that they don't have all of this excess energy spent on worrying about the thing. They just are able to do the things. That's maybe I should call this not an investigation into his personality, but an exegesis, because I'm bringing in a lot of things here, but this is what I draw from it. So anyway, he slept well at night. That's what I take from this. And no moral regrets troubled him. And the people around him in his childhood agreed that, when they watched him, there goes a good Jewish boy, and God has blessed him accordingly. Why aren't you more like Jesus, Johnny? No one was, I guess people were named John, but no one called them Johnny. But anyway, that would have been a great ironic moment in a horrible, horrible movie about Jesus' life. Or they're all like, why aren't you more like Jesus? Oh, no. Oh, is this what the rest of the podcast is going to be? Abandon ship now. Okay. I'm not going to draw any conclusions now, obviously, although I guess I kind of drew a ton in that past thing, but no conclusions on the personality, obviously, because none of these things necessarily excludes any personalities. There's too much room for interpretation here, even after my whole exegesis there. So, fortunately, Luke gives this line as merely the introduction to the story. That's how I interpret it anyway, for his adventure in the temple follows directly after this line, and it is ended by another statement, which is basically just a mirror of this one. So, thus the adventure in the temple is bookended by statements about Jesus' development, indicating that the temple narrative is meant as an example of what Luke is trying to say. Jesus was growing up to be exceptional, but what do I mean by exceptional? Well, let me tell you this little story to demonstrate it, and then we can get on to the important stuff when he was 30. So I'm going to paraphrase briefly the first few lines of this story because they're not as important. Now, Jesus' parents would go every year to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover feast because they were good Jews that they were, and also, by the way, they knew that their son was prophesied to be the Messiah, and therefore they probably felt an obligation to sacrifice whatever they needed to train him as well as they could in Jewish customs, and otherwise raise him to be said Messiah. So they're going to Jerusalem every year. Now, when they did this in Jesus' 12th year, something different happened. It had gone normal up to that point, but at this point, I'll stop paraphrasing and actually get into the actual Greek. And I'm not going to take this stuff apart. I'm just going to give you my basic translation, which doesn't differ in any... Well, none of my translations I consider to differ from how it's laid out. It's just that I'm using different wording to try to better represent the Greek. So I guess, yeah, that is a different translation. But whatever, And having completed the days of the Passover, and setting out to return to Bethlehem, Jesus, just a boy, remained behind in Jerusalem, and his parents didn't know. They naturally assumed that he was with their caravan, so they went a day's journey without him. But when they started visiting with their various relatives and friends to see whom he was with, they didn't find him. So they returned to Jerusalem looking for them. So let's take a pause just to make sure we're clear. Joseph and Mary, his parents, were traveling in a caravan of friends and relatives, which makes perfect sense, by the way, as the roads in Judea are very dangerous, and also most everyone wants to get to Jerusalem for this festival of all festivals. So they're in a big caravan. They're carpooling, as it were, I guess. Furthermore, the word which I translated as, quote, naturally assumed, that word is nomisantes, a tense of nomizo, which in turn derives from nomos, which derives in turn from nemo. Nemo means to parcel out supplies, especially food for one's animals. This becomes nomos, meaning law, that is, the law by which you parse out things, or the custom for doing so. It's, quote, the regulation. Thus, nomizo, which is a verb, means to do by law, to be accustomed to something, to be accustomed to a law. So, what did Jesus' parents do specifically? They were simply accustomed to things being a certain way, possibly or almost certainly from how things went the previous years, or just from the customs of the time, which they had reason to believe Jesus was going to obey. The law, for instance, I say law, it's more of a custom, nomos, for instance, that Jesus would head out with other boys his age or some other adults to set up camp before everyone else so they didn't have to wait around in Jerusalem while the older people got all their stuff together or finalized everything. The point is that Jesus' parents were not being negligent. On the contrary, they were following the rules perfectly well. It was Jesus who tacitly, quote, broke the rules by remaining behind. I'm going to explain this a bit more. Note that Jesus was not passively left behind. The record makes clear, as we'll see more and more, that he actively chose to remain behind. He wasn't being negligent either, and certainly not absent-minded. He decided to do this, knowing full well that his parents wouldn't likely be pleased by it. The word used is hypomenon, from hypomeno, from both hypo and meno. Meno means to stay, abide, continue, dwell, and hypo means under, either in place, beneath, or causatively, under the means of something. So hypomeno means to stay under, to continue under, and thus to remain, or figuratively to undergo something, to endure a trial. So the sense is active. One chooses to tarry behind, to remain behind for some reason or other. Jesus didn't get lost or confused or accidentally get left behind. So let's move on with the record. And it was that after 3 days they found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the professors, the scribes of the law, both hearing them and questioning them. In fact, all those giving him audience were surprised at his ability to understand and his responses to them. So, a few notes here. Not 3 days searching in Jerusalem. Joseph and Mary weren't in Jerusalem for 3 days looking for him, but it was 3 days since they left Jerusalem. So 1 day out, 1 day back, and then 1 day searching. They found him in the temple, likely in one of the chambers, which was set apart for the rabbis to teach Jewish boys who came in. So what happened there, or what was happening there? In what situation did they find him? Why, circled about by curious rabbis and teachers of the law. He was not merely attending a class, he had effectively hijacked the class, because everybody was now focused on him. Oh, this is very strange. Specifically, the word is existanto, that is, they were caused to stand out of whatever state they were in previously. This is just a roundabout way of saying they were astounded or amazed by something. And what astounded them? What so caught their interest? Jesus' synesai and his ηὐξanen. The former word is the tense of sunesis, which comes from suniemi, which is the marriage of sun and hemi. Now, sun is a preposition for union, association, addition, etc. Hemi simply means to send in a variety of ways. So, suniemi means to send into union, or simply to put together. And thus, in the mental realm, it means to comprehend something, to synthesize something in your mind. Interestingly, this can also, by implication, mean to act piously because one has now considered the matter and understands its true implications, its religious implications. This, in turn, becomes the noun sunesis, which means the act of comprehension itself, the act of a mental putting together, which may retain implications of the resulting piety. So, in summary, they were astounded at Jesus' ability to synthesize information, to put two and two together, and likely his resultantly deepened piety. How could they tell he had such understanding, such synthetic intellect? His ηὐξanen, a plural of apokrisis, which is a noun from the verb apokrinomai, which is a combination of apo and krino. Apo means off and away. Krino is a widely applied word, but generally it means to be of opinion or to deem. So apokrinomai means to deem off and away, towards someone else, roughly to give your opinion to someone else. This turns into the noun apokrisis, a given opinion, or just simply a response, an answer. So they were astounded at the opinions and conclusions which he gave them, and how these answers demonstrated his ability to put two and two together. Let's go back to the record. Don't worry, we'll be talking more about this and what this means in a bit. And seeing him, his parents were dumbstruck, and his mother said to him, "Son, why have you done this to us? Look, your father and I were worried sick, looking for you." And Jesus said to them, "Why were you seeking me? Weren't you aware that in the affairs of my Father it obliges me to be?" These are the earliest words spoken by Jesus that have been recorded chronologically in the gospel harmony of his life. So I'd like to give them a thorough look, both the text itself and the full context they are in. So I'm going to, here is the Greek lettering down at the bottom. So first of all, Jesus' response begins with the same interrogative pronoun that his mother used when she spoke. The word is T, and actually if you look at the Greek, you'll see that it's spelled the same way that we spell it, T. It's probably pronounced differently, but oh well. So Jesus, is answering Mary's question with a mimicking question. She asks him what he is doing, and he replies with, "No, what are you doing?" Because they both start in the same way. Of course, Jesus is more specific. He asks his mother why she was ηζήτηται him. I don't know how that should be pronounced. There's a lot of vowels in that word. Jeez. Once again, it is the same word his mother used. I can at least spell it right in the transliterated form. It's the same word that his mother used to say that they were looking for him, seeking for him, endeavoring after him. So she asks, "We were endeavoring after you." And he's like, "Why were you endeavoring after me?" But then, what does he ask? "Didn't you ηδείτε?" This is a form of eido, meaning most basically to see, but by implication to know, to be aware, to consider, to perceive. So he is really asking them, didn't you know? Weren't you aware? Well, what didn't they know? That in tois of his patros dei him to be. Now, tois is merely a demonstrative, i.e., the, this, that, he, she, it, etc. Patros just means father, but in the record it's capitalized, obviously indicating something other than his mortal father Joseph. And dei is derived from deo, which means to bind, tie, knit, wind. Thus, dei is given to mean I am bound to something. It is needful that I do this thing. I am behooved to do it, obliged to do it. So, Jesus is saying, weren't you aware of my obligation to be here? Well, of course Mary and Joseph weren't aware of an obligation for him to be there. There was no reason for them to assume that Jesus would skip out on the return trip without making his intentions explicit. He didn't tell them about this beforehand. Otherwise, I'm sure it would have been mentioned in the record. Jesus would have to have known that they were leaving that day because the Passover is over, and they would have definitely told him the plans and made them explicit. And if not, then someone else they came with. It was no minor inconvenience to leave someone behind in Jerusalem. Okay? As we saw from Mary and Joseph's distress in trying to find him. In fact, the word Mary uses to describe their state is quite severe. Oduao means torment, sorrow, grief, in such a way that it's probably implying they were worried he was dead because people would get killed in Jerusalem or on the road or everywhere here. It was full of thieves and robbers. It's like there's a possibility that, like, if you didn't follow the plan, you're possibly dead. So he deliberately did not tell them. There's no feasible way in my mind that he just accidentally got lost. He would have had to effectively been pulling a stunt. He was making a point. He deliberated this and he figured out how to do it. I'm emphasizing this just to try to make it clear because it's not explicitly stated in the record, but in my mind it's just I can't see how it's feasible that he could have accidentally remained behind in Jerusalem. That just simply can't be what's going on, especially because the whole point of this story is to show how wise he was. And if he accidentally got left behind, that would not be a very good indicator of how wise he is. So he deliberately stayed behind for 3 days. And the only reason I can think of for him to do that is specifically to make a point. But they did not put together what the saying that he said to them meant. That's my translation of the verse. So Mary and Joseph didn't actually get his point, at least not at that time. And that's perfectly understandable, as he simply says to them in explanation, "Why did you have to look for me? Didn't you assume I'd be here about God's business? Don't you know me well enough by now? I'm tempted to take liberties with this translation and say, I'm shocked you would think I were anywhere but here in the temple, being a good Jewish boy. And note that this would all be said with a sort of harmless, playful sarcasm. Because what other tone could he have in this situation? If he does not have a knowing tone, then he would have to be supremely absent-minded, the opposite of the clear-mindedness which Luke is intending to demonstrate here. Jesus knows perfectly well what he's put his parents through, even if just abstractly, and now, instead of any sign of apology, he simply replies, not, in fact, with a solemn, I am in the temple, being the Messiah, so don't interrupt me, or even a direct explanation that acknowledges their pain, but with a witty retort, why would you look anywhere else for me? He might as well add, it took you long enough to find me, I was starting to think you weren't even coming. I'm probably exaggerating that too much, but I can't see it any other way. So once again, what was Jesus' point? Why did he do this? He said, I am obliged to be about this sort of thing for my Father's sake. And that is a rather odd answer to make, by the way. You ask, why did you do this, Jesus? And Jesus answered, I was obliged by God to do it. But frankly, there's more to it than that. And let me just tell you this now. With Jesus and all of the Gospels, what I've been studying so far, there is always more to it. The man was a natural Isaiah. That is to say, he was exceptional in the ancient Jewish art, as I understand it and as I've sort of seen it from my study of the Scriptures. He was very, very good at what was traditional for them, which is the art of saying multiple things at once, like poetry, something that is found throughout their prophets and poets and often admired in their rabbis and teachers, and especially found in Isaiah. Jesus probably held the rabbi's attention so well as a child because even at that age he was very good at this, at only that age of 12. It is the ability to say something that applies successfully to one's current, present situation, yet also applies to a future, more important situation, along with, say, a universal truth or a wisdom even higher than that. So you have all these layers here. In some sense, it's a sensitivity to what I'll call the isomorphic nature of the universe. The underlying patterns of the universe that show up again and again, albeit in different skins. For example, Isaiah would make prophecies that seemed perfectly relevant to his own time. But if you know some key things beforehand, then you can also recognize that he is also making a prophecy about the future. He might say, for instance, at a baby shower, Unto you a child is born, and his name shall be Peace, signifying that God will not allow our city to be destroyed at this time. And y'all, well, first of all, you'd be like, why are you at our baby shower? But, sorry, this bearded fellow, well, I'm assuming he had a beard, everyone had a beard. But anyway, so it seems colloquial enough. I mean, well, it would be very odd if someone did that, but you understand the point. It's odd because why on earth would you choose to make a prophecy using a baby, like a prophecy? So first of all, he would say, unto us a child is born, and he would say it in such a way that it would seem possibly like all he's saying is, you should name your baby Peace. But if you were of a poetic mind, then you would recognize that, oh, he's actually saying, because we were expecting him to make a prophecy about this because we're worried about, the Assyrians or whoever coming down to kill us all. And he is prophesying, no, unto you a child is born and his name shall be Peace. And we're like, great, peace means that we're going to be safe because they just sort of understood the stuff. But then there's another meaning to it also. And this crops up again and again. Because you think to yourself, why would you use a baby to do that? Is it just because it was convenient, like you just happened to get the revelation while you're at a baby shower? No. It's because he's really also making a prophecy about the birth of the Messiah, who will deliver people from a later threat. And it might even have another meaning after that. So when he says, unto us a child is born, He's saying that there is this isomorphic similarity between the fact that you are giving birth to a baby now in a time of distress, and that baby's birth marks a point at which there will be change. And that is a repeating pattern throughout history, that this happens, and that the time that I want to point your mind to is when that will happen, when the Messiah is born. So it's sort of this recognizing the inherently poetic or mimetic or, Jung might say archetypal nature of the universe, if you want to put it that way. And you can go beyond this, by the way, and this happens also because we don't really understand this. We don't have prophets or poets in the ancient style, because really what you would do, if you're really good at it, is it was almost like a form of performance art, because you wouldn't just say things, you would do things, and the thing would be symbolic. It would have no efficient purpose. It would be beyond an efficient purpose because it's meant to signify something. Like, that's why there's these people in the Bible doing all these weird things. Like, sometimes it doesn't seem weird. Sometimes we're like, that's so cool. Like, we get it. But there's other things that it's like, why did you go in under the prophetess Isaiah and conceive a child and then name him Mahalalahashbaz? Or, sorry, I can't remember the name because it's so long and the name means something. And it's like, why didn't you just go to the authorities and tell them what was going to happen? But it's just they did not think in that efficient way, because they're not just trying to do stuff in the present right now. They're trying to do stuff that has meaning throughout time and eternity. That's the best way I can explain it. And Jesus falls right into this tradition, and he's very good at it. And you can see this in his response to his parents, because he's trying to make a point to them. So, and by the way, this is a recurring motif in Jesus' life, is that he's so good at this, and he knows so much that people aren't able to perceive through all the layers of meaning, and so they misunderstand him. Now, in the case of the Pharisees and other Jewish professors, they should have known better, because they're trained in this, or at least they're supposed to have been trained in this, and so they oftentimes are deliberately misunderstanding him. They know what he's trying to say, but they're so frustrated and angry with him that they decide, it's actually a lot like, I don't know, if you've ever met someone who doesn't speak your native language, whether it's English or German or French or whatever, and you'll have it a lot, at least sometimes I've run into it. For me, I speak English, obviously, but sometimes you'll run into somebody who is foreign and they've immigrated here, and you're trying to converse with them about something, and if they don't like what you're saying or they don't really want to reply, then even though they've been talking with you fine up to that point, they'll just suddenly start acting as though they don't speak English very well. And it's so frustrating, because it's I was just conversing with you. Stop. The whole point of... Anyway, I don't want to get into all of that, but it's like that with the Pharisees, though, where it's you guys know perfectly well what Jesus is saying. The fishermen or the other people who were more from Jesus's class, who were more normal boys their age, who weren't able to pick up on the Jewish language and stuff so quickly, they have a pass, but the Pharisees don't have a pass, because this is what they do. Anyway, so finally, addressing what it was that Jesus was actually saying here. What was his actual point? Well, on the surface, it seems that he's really just saying, I'm a good Jewish boy. Of course you'd find me in the temple being about God's business, as all good Jewish boys would be. What, did you check the bars first? I mean, they didn't have bars, but you know what I mean. Where else did you think you were going to find me? And this he sort of means jokingly. But there's another layer on it, obviously, and this is a reminder to Joseph that he is not Jesus' real father. It's kind of a punch in the gut, to be honest. I mean, done, I think, actually humbly, but, well, maybe this is kind of a stretch, but I can see easily how, he's 12 years old, and when they return home to Nazareth, he would be continuing learning Joseph's trade and taking over their family's work, or whatever it is that they were doing to support themselves. It's listed as them being a carpenter in the scriptures. Though I still need to look to check what specifically the word behind carpenter means. So anyway, Jesus is actually saying, yeah, that's not my real job, because you're not really my father. God is my father. So I'm taking over his trade, his quote trade. And that's a stretch because he never uses any words that just mean trade. He simply means, didn't you know that I should be about my father's? He doesn't even say business. What he says is, didn't you know I should be about this of my father? So he never specifies, but there's implications that you could simply translate that as the affairs of my father, or, quote, the business of my father. Anyway, even if you set that whole speculation aside, it does remain that Jesus would have known full well, and likely plenty of other people knew it too, that Mary was not originally impregnated by Joseph, but by some other means. And this is brought up in later Roman documents, by the way, as a common derogative against the Christians, that their Savior was a child of adultery, and they were trying to use that to mock people. That Jesus should bring up this point in the temple in this way is an almost cruel blow against Joseph. He's saying, I'm not going back with you to your house because that isn't really my house, and you're not really my dad, Joseph. God is my dad, therefore this is my house, and this is our family business. That's kind of how I interpret it. He's trying to get him prepared for what he's going to do. Yet there's another layer which indicates something about religion. Why did you have to look for me if I'm the Christ? Why didn't you look in the temple first? Isn't that where things of God should be found? The point being that the temple is God's house, and one should expect to find answers there. And yet another layer, and I think the most important layer, and probably the more plausible layer, it's a reference to Jesus' later death. By the way, Jesus references his own death a lot, probably because it's in the scriptures. And he knew he was the Messiah. He knew the Messiah is going to die from reading Isaiah, and I'll get into that later. But so he's making a prophecy. It took Joseph and Mary 3 days to find Jesus, which I'm sure a number of you noticed. And they were sorrowing as for someone dead. And so when they find him in the temple, he's very nonchalant and asks them why they feared so much. Didn't they have faith that he really was the Messiah and God was going to protect him? Didn't they just assume that rather than him being dead, he was simply doing more of God's work elsewhere on the other side? And I think this is the clearest point. He was from an early age playing performance artist in order to teach his parents, whenever they were ready to understand him, what was going to happen. It often was that people would only understand his prophecies after the fact, and it gave them great comfort, kind of like giving someone a magic locket that only opens when the time is right. The story closes with the following lines, which kind of help to solidify some of these interpretations of Jesus as, at least as playing performance artist. But he came down and accompanied them to Nazareth and was obedient to them, meaning even though he said these things, he still came with them, and we're not told what exchange that was, and it seems, to me, it implies that he did it of his free will. He wasn't persuaded or something. And his mother kept close all these sayings in her heart, so keeping close what he said to her, meaning that it had meaning for them. It wasn't just he had been lost and then they found him and he's like, oh, I was just doing God's work. It's like, no, when he said that, he was being poetical, and she treasured it in her heart. She kept it close. She watched over it. That's what the word means, basically. So Jesus drove forward in such wisdom and maturity and well-faring before God and men. So wrapping it up, so that the story is now meant as a demonstration of those traits. Now, I'm going to give sort of a sketch of the personality that I see arising, and because when I first looked over this story, it was just like a flood. I think because I had never really done it before, and I'd always kind of had this notion of looking at the character of Jesus as described in the scriptures. He's sort of always portrayed as faceless, and as he's not really a person, and therefore it's kind of like it takes all of the meaning and tension out of the things that were happening to him, because you can't really have conflict unless you have a character who is enduring the conflict, and you can't have a character unless they're actually a character. And, you know, in the same way that you can't really have a consciousness unless you have certain, quote, limitations, because if the consciousness is just simply everything going into it and out of it all at once, it's like it's not actually a thing. You have to, it's something that Jordan Peterson talked about in one of his videos, and how they were struggling with making AI because they realized you actually have to have a body, which limits down the amount of stimulus that you get and simplifies things, or limits things so that you're actually able to process it. He does a much better job of explaining it, but I think it's the same thing with having a personality. So I'm trying to paint a picture or sketch that actually gives him more of a personality. So this is kind of what I'm getting so far. What I see is a sketch of a young man with a knowing look, but without any guile. So a young man who, in fact, they're unbearably lonely because he is unbearably lonely, because he is, and knows that he is, leaps and bounds ahead of other people. He understands faster than anyone around him, anyone his age anyway, and he loves the opportunity to make efficient use of that, like he was in the temple when he's answering questions, asking questions, and keeping up with these people and even exceeding them. And because they were astounded, they were like, wow, he really understands this stuff. He's putting this complex stuff together. He understands faster than anyone around him. He knows things that would blow your mind, and if only you were able to bear it, then maybe he wouldn't be so alone. He knows so much, yet he can only say so little, because otherwise people would freak out. So he speaks in parables and triple meanings and riddles, not because he fears other people freaking out in sort of this FE sense like that I feel, but because that would not actually help the situation nor them. It's a more efficient way of thinking about it. If it would help, then he would do it. He's efficient. One might be tempted to argue that he goes too far in places in making a point, or that he shows a lack of concern, but that isn't true. It's quite the opposite. He cares so deeply, but he does not express it at all in this FE outwards way where you're always checking up on other people. And he's more able to act contrary to the FE sort of notions, unabashedly making himself an exception to rules, apparently, at least social rules. So he has a cheer that others might mistake for carelessness. He knows everything is going to be all right. He sees the matrix. He's at peace with his maker. But everyone else is so worried all the time and about everything. Sometimes he just wishes he could shake people out of that. But as it stands, he only does it with his parents because that is important, that he get them to understand. It is important that they really understand, that they remember what they themselves assuredly told him about all these prophecies, like in the temple with Simon and Anna, about what the wise men were there for when he was an infant, about who he is. And then Jesus prayed about it. He went out into the mountains or the wilderness or his closet, and he prayed and received his answer. Something crazy, to be sure, something terrifying. Yet he was of such a character, and the witness he received of such a kind, that he knew it was true. Jesus was the Messiah, which would be so terrifying. There's no way that anyone but him, like anyone who gets that, it's like, you have to wonder how often he thought he was crazy. I don't think he thought he was crazy. I think the nature of the witness made it so that he knew he wasn't crazy, even though, like, anyone else would probably say, no, I know that I'm not crazy. Even it's like, no, you're a nutcase. Like, why are you on the street dancing about? Anyway, sorry. Jesus, he studied the scriptures like any good Jewish boy. He studied every passage about the Messiah. He studied Isaiah, and his mind was so fast that he picked things up faster than anyone else. He could put things two and two together. His understanding was quick and confident. That's an important thing. Most others his age never even learned to read for themselves, if we're to trust how that is explained. Yeah, he was different. And he didn't show it off. He hardly told anyone, I suspect, but he could put two and two together. He could synthesize. He could make leaps and bounds that no one else made. And he knew things so confidently and so clearly, things that no one else seemed to see, and would become so upset when he asserted them with the same clarity with which he, in fact, saw them, because other people would... Anyway... I've keep on saying self-consciously, I'm letting my own intuition run its course here. I'm just kind of trying to get it all out. Some of the things are not yet supported by the actual data, and you may have picked something else up from what I was trying to explicate. But this is how I'm seeing it, and you'll probably be able to pick up that I'm already of the opinion that Jesus was INTJ. That's what I got from this story. But this is just like, obviously, well, the reasons being that I see the story as demonstrating a direct violation of FE, not just not attending to FE, but being able to well, it's a very direct violation of it in a way that I've only really seen with ITJ types, INTJ and ISTJ. And I think it's INTJ because of the nature of his intellect. Because his intellect, it's confident, it sets forth to assert things, it's sure of itself, it makes leaps and bounds, and it puts two and two together. So all those things are more, they remind me much more of NI than NE, which is more tentative, it's ironic, it is careful and exploratory, whereas NI is much more assertive, as I understand it. So those are the two prevailing factors, but this is literally, of course, it's just one story, and I've got to do my best to hold back, especially from the fact that I already kind of suspect INTJ. I've got to hold that back because other stories may have very contradictory information, especially because, by the way, Luke, as IDR Labs pointed out, is speaking to what IDR Labs relates to the NT temperament, the rational temperament from Kiersey. So it would make sense that I would see an INTJ or some similar type in there, because that's what Luke's trying to do. So we'll see if this holds through in my later discussions of passages. But anyway, that's all I had for this video, and I think I might be about to hit record time. Thank you so much for listening or watching, and I'll hopefully talk to you in the next one.